We are at our last panel of this symposium, which has been wonderful. Thank you all again for coming out here in the midst of the hurricane-like conditions outside. We have Joe Bach-Coleman moderating this panel. He is an associate research scholar at the Craig Newmark Center for Journalism, Ethics, and Security at Columbia University, and he is a computational social scientist. After this panel is over, we are serving lunch. You're welcome to stay and chat informally with everyone else who is here. Thank you again for coming. Please take it away.
I'm having flashbacks to giving a best man speech before dinner. So bear with me. I think it's been a really great workshop because when I've learned a lot, at the same time I feel further away from answering the question, which is, I think, a sign of progress. I think behind that is there's been this theme that's emerged that there's very little consensus on the scale of complexity that we are interested in optimizing for. Do we want individuals to have a good time online in the moment, or do we want to have groups, have community, or make sure democracy is stable or global peace? And the lever we have to adjust that is really at the level of the individual. We control what they see, how they see it, who they interact with. So we're thinking about cross-scale dynamics, but really interacting with individuals and content. We have to apply those levers in bulk. So they just personalized in the sense that each person sees different things, but algorithmically it's kind of applied en masse. And I think it's hard to know really how those changes will lead to larger scale changes of things we care about and how that'll feed back down to the individual. And that seems to be sort of like one of the key things in the trade-offs we're talking about here with misinformation and free speech and sort of engagement. And like Joel was mentioning, all these things are great, but the user has to want to do it and actually enjoy the experience. So these trade-offs, I think, are really kind of core to why I feel more confused now than I did yesterday. And interestingly, our norms and values seem to have come about in a world where there's a physical structure that creates communities and it bridges us and it creates divisions. And so it offloads a lot of this decision making for us into physical space and time. So it feels a bit like we built a lever and pulled it and then realized it's a trolley car problem. We have to figure out where the train's going, who it's going to hit, who it's going to miss. And so the question that I'm at now is optimizing for what scale of complexity, on what time scale and what contexts, and how do we manage trade-offs, and how do we technically manage any of that? And these talks actually, I think, get at that question in a lot of different ways. So I'll stop talking and pass this over to Georgina Bourne, who's a professor of anthropology and music at the Department of Anthropology, University College London. She previously taught at Oxford and Cambridge. And earlier, she had a professional life as a musician in experimental rock, jazz, and improvised music, which is well worth a Google and a listen, I can assure you. Whatever you want to do.
So thanks very much, Joe. Can you hear me okay? Good, okay. And warm thanks for the whole event to Katie and Arvind and the rest of the team at the Knight Institute. So this is the final panel, and we return to normative questions. We heard about this yesterday, and today my collaborator Fernando Diaz and I are introducing a new perspective concerned with the well-being of our collective public life. Our focus is on music recommendation systems, and music here becomes a lens through which to address the algorithmic curation of cultural and entertainment content by streaming platforms writ large. Current debates tend to neglect the cumulative influence of recommender systems on the evolution of cultural experience and taste across populations and over time, shaping the cultures and societies in which they're used. Now, we want to dwell on this power, asking, if we acknowledge this cumulative influence of recommendation, to which societal and cultural ends should this influence be directed? Music recommender systems, as most of you know, base their curatorial decisions on algorithms optimized for objectives like engagement, retention, and ad revenue. Even in cases where the language of diversity is used, it's done selectively and to the end of profit. Multiple studies demonstrate the problematic effects of this kind of optimization. Some genres and content creators are amplified, while many other musicians and musical cultures are never represented. Now, if existing studies describe these kind of distortions, they don't tell us what a more just curation might look like. Could new forms of algorithmic curation be developed to promote cultural experiences oriented to social justice and the public good? For guidance on normative values that have been productive for public culture, we turn to principles guiding public service media systems. We call them PSM. So public service media like the BBC, the Canadian and Australian broadcasting corporations is a worldwide phenomenon. The BBC is often the model, and it's exerted a lot of influence historically on public interest models of media organization in Europe and the Commonwealth. We take our lead from the normative principles underlying the BBC. I myself did 15 years of work, and I've published widely on the BBC and PSM. The recent Twitter storm over the BBC's designation as government-funded media repeats a common misunderstanding. The BBC is not a state broadcaster. It's publicly funded by a dedicated tax, and it's independent of government, albeit imperfectly, as those following the news yesterday and today will realize. The institutions of PSM have been a central plank of many democratic cultures. These principles, refined over decades in the production and distribution of numerous genres of cultural and entertainment content, can expand the desiderata of recommender systems to include values that enhance the cultural and social development of contemporary societies. Now, while our work is inspired by and relevant to PSM organizations designing recommender systems, we believe it's also relevant to commercial music recommender systems interested in fostering similar goals. And I think the last panel kind of ended edging towards this idea of a public infrastructure. Now, the PSM principles are big ideas. They include citizenship, universality, independence, quality, innovation, diversity, accountability, and participation. Of course, they need interpreting and elaborating, and then translating into the design of new systems. And this is the work we've begun. Our current work expands on our previously published work in 5 ways. I'm going to go very briefly through. To do this, like Christian and Tomo, who presented yesterday, we want to reconceptualize recommender systems as larger socio-technical systems, making it possible to expand the scope of the translation of normative values into design of these larger systems. So we begin with critiques informed by the normative values I've mentioned. Our first target is personalization, a core property of recommender systems. Now, the personalization paradigm, as you all know, is ubiquitous. It conceives of the effects of recommendation as a kind of aggregate individuation. But this is inadequate both empirically and normatively. Personalization encourages fragmentation and atomization based on the recursive individuation of users. This is destructive of the cultural fabric underpinning our deepest social identifications. In contrast, the PSM principles of citizenship and universality begin from the recognition of human life as embedded in social and cultural communities, addressing consumers not just as individuals, but as publics composed of citizen consumers. We draw, in the longer paper, on political philosophy to propose that it's this mode of address that should be taken to recommender systems. But we go further, employing the idea of cultural citizenship, which responds to the vast social transformations posed by globalization, migration, and the intensification of identity politics among subaltern groups. In the context of multicultural societies, cultural citizenship draws attention to the urgency of demands for cultural rights, including the right to symbolic presence, to dignifying representation, and the maintenance of distinct cultural identities. The implication is the need for cultural curation at scale by recommender systems to focus both on commonality and on plurality, on the provision of unifying but also intercultural and at times intracultural forms of cultural experience. Our second critique concerns the model of the user immanent in recommender systems. Now, this model assumes that individual consumers come with fully formed tastes and desires and merely seek something similar in the next track they listen to. Recommendation is modeled in the terms of serial, individual, one-off choices guided by ideas of similarity between tracks, users, and contexts, and by data, of course, on past behavior. Music recommenders, therefore, occlude questions of aesthetic experience in both their model of the user's relationship to music and the editorial processes that guide curation. Any more temporally extended concern with the dynamic development of taste or with how taste should evolve over time, either over an individual life course or collectively in the sense of progressive cultural change, are evacuated, or, as in current language models, they reproduce and reinforce dominant trajectories found in usage data. The prevailing model of the user is then impoverished, and it lacks awareness of the normative curatorial responsibility to enable the progressive development of users' aesthetic experience. Note that this is not an elitist point. It holds for the appreciation of popular music as much as art music. And here we're drawing on work from cultural studies showing that the progressive development of aesthetic experience both occurs and matters deeply in relation to popular culture and entertainment. Content must be curated so that it doesn't just meet past tastes, but moves the listener along, introducing difference, exceeding her expectations, generating new experiences and new expectations. A third proposal follows on. We contend that human editors are vital to the cultural curation we're proposing based on normative principles. But we move beyond the individual gatekeeper model, that idea of the individual expert. Citing the normative value of participation, we argue that today aesthetic judgment is both individual and social, shared among all those participating in what we call a value community, and the object of collective reflection over the quality of artists, genres, or individual tracks. In this light, the role of editors is to reflect on the quality, innovation, or diversity of recommendation by drawing on insights and judgments generated by the larger value community, knowledgeable about the music being recommended, and then to intervene editorially so as to amplify these desired qualities. Cultivating values of quality, innovation, and diversity in what is recommended requires human editors because algorithms alone will never draw curation closer to such value communities, given the limitations of how good is quantified in existing recommender systems. Akin to participatory design, the editors act then as conduits for larger communities of taste and interest, and their judgments will, of course, be validated by and accountable to those communities. So our final two proposals zoom out further in the socio-technical system and both address the oligopolistic industry structure of recommendation, the extreme concentration exhibited by the global platforms as they function worldwide through licensing and acquisition deals with the major record companies, in this way constraining the space of possible tracks that can be recommended and dictating the cost associated with those tracks. In short, radically restricting the diversity of both source and content in the music recommended. Our first proposal is about the catalogue of music on which recommenders draw. It is very simply that alternative public interest catalogues should be developed through partnerships to counteract this structure. The BBC, interestingly, provides a precursor. It's called the Creative Archive, and it was their attempt in the mid-2000s to create partnerships with other major public cultural institutions in Britain to generate a vast, publicly funded audiovisual and music archive available for free download for consumption and non-profit creative reuse. Our second proposal comes to regulation in a different way, and mentioned at the end of that panel, and it's again about creating conditions conducive to diversity of source and content. And it's the need to regulate for simply a less concentrated, more pluralistic industry to allow medium-sized and small independent companies access to the recommender economy. Now, it's a feature of the history of the old music industry that a rise in innovative, diverse output was correlated with periods in which the industry was less concentrated. So to end, culture is always curated. Great phrase from my colleague Tarleton Gillespie, who gave this phrase yesterday. And currently, recommended design denies its role in the mass curation of cultural experience. We contend that this denial has to end. Let's talk about the curation of culture to enhance the making of cultural publics and for the public good. Thank you.
So our next speaker, his bio is a little bit out of date, but as of some time recently, he is or was affiliated with Harvard Brick and Klein Center. He is or was a visiting researcher at Cambridge University Center for the Future of Intelligence. He did or does consult for technology companies, civil society organizations, and funders, and he researched or researches and supported or supports approaches for technology governance, building on insights from offline deliberative democracy and AI-augmented deliberation technology. So Aviv, whenever you're ready, and if there's a timer if you need it.
Yes, that would be great. Yes, thank you for that most excellent introduction. So I'm Aviv Ovadya. I work at the intersection of AI, platforms, information, and governance. I'm going to give a quick overview behind bridging systems that were alluded to last panel, some of the real-world use of it by platforms, and how this relates to other important threads. And most of this work was done in collaboration with Luke Thorburn, and bridging systems in particular. That paper was all in collaboration. He's in the audience here also. So in some ways, when we talk about bridging systems, we're really just talking about correcting a massive oversight. If we define a bridging system as something that increases mutual understanding and trust across divides, oh, sorry, there are two separate things I need to move here. Most of the other sort of definitions have been brought up today. It's something that was embedded across society. We've had cultures, traditions, institutions, nonverbal cues, family structures, all of which ensure that we had some level of bridging that's necessary for society's level of trust. Our economic systems even depend on that level of bridging. And so the idea that we now need algorithms that are meeting our communication, and that they're not actively, they're only optimizing for engagement as sort of the core is sort of weird. And so bridging-based ranking, the idea here is that we want to have rank systems that are explicitly trying to increase mutual understanding across divides. Oops, sorry, this is the challenge here. So what does that look like in practice? Here's an example to one approach to bridging: diverse approval. With engagement-based ranking, the posts that get the most divisive reactions, they're often ranked the highest. And here you can see sort of red hates something, blue loves it. With diverse approval, the posts that are liked the most across divides are ranked highest instead, and the most divisive posts are ranked lowest. And before I go any farther, I want to clarify common misunderstandings. When I'm talking about something like bridging, I'm not talking about eliminating conflict or promoting a particular viewpoint. It's just promoting more productive forms of conflict. And it's not always directly practical with simpler approaches like diverse approval, but this is what we're ultimately aiming to measure. And bridging is not just about showing people content from the other side. That can make things worse. And the goal is not just to rank content higher if it's approved of by the majority. And so for more detail on the rationale behind all this, There's a report published with Harvard's Belfer Center that focuses on that. And it's really focusing on sort of the policy as like bridging as this missing ingredient, this thing that we're not optimizing for enough. But parallel to that, and sort of following the success of that, Luke and I spent a year sort of diving into the technical and social challenges and open problems around bridging in practice in our ranking and recommender systems. So that paper is sort of the core focus here. And you can see the preprint for that now already. It's linked to from bridging.systems. And it's all deeply informed by the work of many people, including Amanda Ripley, Jonathan Stray is here, Chris Bale. And the goal is to reconceptualize again, like so many of us before, what online platforms are and how they connect to our ideas of offline environments. We formalize attention allocation as this thing that's core to communication processes that can bridge divides, and then we use that to look at open problems that help accelerate the development of things like bridging-based ranking systems that optimize for this different optimization target. And metrics are the core to this. You cannot improve something that you cannot measure, and you won't know if they're even sort of improvements are working. So I'm not going to get into the technical details here, but this sort of shows, this diagram shows the sort of leverage points of bridging across different kinds of systems, whether it be a Facebook group, a YouTube recommendation algorithm, a poll list discussion that was mentioned, or even a facilitated conflict mediation. These things are always happening implicitly in the facilitators. So we're going to call out a set of rich open problems across many disciplines and practice areas. So like, for example, how do systems that represent information about people and their relationships to each other, like how are they representing that? What kinds of metrics are appropriate to capture that intuition of bridging, including across different contexts and actually make them practical to use? What are the heuristics that are helpful, and how do we help evaluate them? And how do we address robustness to attackers' ethical challenges, economic incentives? There's a lot of open questions, right? But the status quo right now is, like as we've discussed, in some ways, it's so bad that we want to encourage not just academic, but active experimentation. And there has been some by platforms. It seems like it's hubris for us to think that we can move our society from algorithmically mediated, to algorithmically mediated communication without building bridging into the core of that. And so most of the impacts of this work are sort of private in the way that platforms are doing things, but there is a notable exception where Twitter has been actively investing in bridging in an explicit, though narrow way. And it does seem to help. It survived the Elon Musk transition. There are challenges with community notes, which are using a bridging-based ranking system, but it is better than not having it. And I think that's going to be true in many of these environments. And you know, there might be some critique on that we'll hear. But more generally, the point of bridging-based ranking, bridging systems, is to sort of provide ammo, in a sense, for employees to say explicitly, here is a very concrete, different thing that we can add or optimize for. And they can point to Twitter as an apparent success of that, where it really has had some very concrete positive impacts that you can point to particular tweets. But I want to address another really important challenge to bridging, and this is sort of what led to me completely rechanging this deck to fit this in the last like day or so, because this keep coming up, and this is another line of work that I think is going to be really relevant to this audience. And this is this question of who decides, right? How do we decide what we're even optimizing for? Like, isn't engagement just based ranking just giving people what they want? Isn't that what they've said they wanted? And so this led to this parallel work stream for about 3 years, which is how do we best understand that? And not only that, who should be deciding how much bridging or engagement is the right thing to do? Like, is it social media companies or governments or whatever? And this is from a survey from the Knight Foundation, not the Knight First Amendment Institute, to clarify. And this, and so I wanted to understand sort of what are the ways to answer those questions with democratic legitimacy that are actually applicable to transnational platforms where you have multiple governments that, you know, and there might be a single system that is being governed. And my conclusion is that we can actually build on decades of experience in applied deliberative democracy and deliberative tools to provide richer, deeper, better informed answers around what systems should optimize for in a way that actually protects against the excesses of both companies and governments. And it's great when democratic governments can effectively legislate on platforms without partisan pressure, but that alone does not sufficiently regulate either transnational impacts or platform-specific decisions. And there are ways to address that. And in particular, citizen assembly, sortition, collective response systems, they provide some of these keys. And this isn't just idealism. There are unexpectedly aligned incentives here that make it practically possible for platforms themselves to have independent third parties run democratic processes, even where in places where government regulation might be stalled. And I have permission to actually share a little bit about something that's both exciting and depressing relating to this conference on this, which is that last year, I had set up Twitter to actually work with such a third party to run a pilot of a process like this, to answer questions around what they should be amplifying, and how do they balance free expression and their other responsibilities. And this was going to be kicked off when the acquisition stalled everything, and everyone on the relevant teams was fired. And so, yeah, so it's exciting and depressing. But other powerful technology companies are exploring these approaches, and there are actually benefits to delegating to some third-party process that they have little to no control over, but which allows them to determine the answers to these thorny questions. To protect against the excesses of both the companies and the authoritarian and potentially very partisan and self-serving governments. No, sorry. Sorry, this is the multi-slide problem. Okay, so what does it actually mean in practice? You bring together this representative microcosm of an impacted population, have them deliberate on what should be done with access and input to experts and stakeholders, and there's a democratic foundation here that rests on this idea of a democratic lottery where every person has an equal chance of being selected. This is an overly positive and solutionist way to describe this because I have very limited time. I'd love to get into the weeds of sort of how this affects all the different trade-offs that sort of come into doing something like this. But to make it really visceral, this is an in-person version of such a process convened by the EU. These are not elected representatives in the European hemicycle, but people selected by democratic lottery, essentially at random from across all of the EU countries, deliberating across all of the EU official languages, helping determine its future. And so going back to bridging, ultimately, I think the population's being impacted by powerful platforms and these AI systems, and other kinds of AI systems like the generative ones, those populations should be the ones who are ultimately deciding. And my intuition is, should be deciding sort of what those systems are optimized for, what they're aiming to reward. And my intuition is that people will actually want more bridging than we currently have in these systems. And we hope that the Bridging Systems paper helps at least provide a concrete thing that you can put on the map for people to decide between. Thank you. And thank you all for hosting.
All right. We have one more speaker for the workshop. Alessandro Piscopo is a lead data scientist at the BBC's product group. His team, Data Lab, develops recommendation engines across the organization and has deployed live recommenders on products such as BBC Sounds, BBC World Service, and the BBC News app, something probably most of us have used. His research interests lie at the intersection of peer production communities, collaborative knowledge engineering, data quality, and responsible AI. Give me a timer, it's just up there.
Okay, thank you. I'm aware I'm standing between you and your lunch, so, but I think this is very complementary to the presentations we've just heard. Let's start with something. What are recommenders? I understand this is a room where mostly everyone knows what a recommender is, what a recommender system is. But I think it's good to point out, just to give a definition as a starting point. And I think recommenders are a way to sift through large catalogs and surface relevant and tailored content to users. Well, everybody, just if you think about Netflix, Spotify, you have in mind just what it means in practice for you. The thing is, just given the definition I've just given, this is something we, as an organization, have always done, deciding what's going on the homepage of BBC News, deciding which content gets promoted and which doesn't. However, we decided as an organization that it was about time. This has been just done manually so far, but we thought that we wanted to give our audiences a personalized experience, and because we wanted to provide value for money, we have lots of content, but also we have lots of users. So how to just make sure these users make the most over time, and we wanted to just give users a personalized experience because they expect it. They think it's valuable to have personal experience. So in this way, just you can understand, recommendations are, after all, editorial curation at scale. Now, the thing is, very often recommender systems, we've heard it just throughout these 2 days, are optimized for engagement. But that's where things get a bit more difficult, especially for a public service organization as the BBC. So what does being a public service organization mean? Well, we've just heard it from Georgina. I will use perhaps more institutional words to that, but I think they very much reconnect to what she said. Just we are a public service organization because our mission and values and public purposes are defined by our charter, and our mission is to act in the public interest, serving all audiences through the provision of impartial, high quality and distinctive output and services, which inform, educate, and entertain. I won't go in detail through all public purposes, but just to mention some, like we want to provide impartial news and information to help people understand the world around them. We want to support learning. We want to show the most creative and highest quality content. And we want to reflect and represent the diverse communities of the United Kingdom. So impartiality, universality, diversity, learning, creativity. Now, let's reconnect with what we were saying. Just recommendations are very often optimized for engagement. The problem is just the metrics used for engagement. And engagement itself is a very rough approximation of our definition of values and for our public purposes. So from that, the first challenge derives, which is how should goals and values be encoded into the BBC's recommendation algorithm? But we take this as a socio-technical challenge, not only a technical one. And from that, it derives our second challenge, which is how should different points of view, and those in particular, those represented by editorial, data science, and product, be brought together to ensure relevant domain knowledge is represented in our recommender systems. And I'm going to tell you about how we try to address these challenges by voicing these three sides of the equation: data science, product, and editorial. As a BBC person, I should have some props, possibly a wig or something to pretend I'm. But unfortunately, I don't have them, so I will start just by telling, starting from my perspective, which is a data scientist. As data scientists, our role is to translate our product and editorial requirements into actual recommenders. So over the whole process of the development of recommenders, we go from the product problem definition to exploration to refining our models. We take into account editorial and product feedback, and we try to translate it into technical approaches, which might even require developing tools like what we've done in the past to optimize, to gather editorial feedback, and then tweak our algorithms accordingly. And of course, and the editorial involvement, the conversation we have with the other sides depends on where we are in the process. I'll quickly move to the other voices in these in this circle, in these three sides of the equation, because I know the clock is ticking now. But looking at the product side, say product managers have the role to lead on defining the strategy and objectives, identifying new product opportunities, and ensure teams have the context needed to build successful product. They looked at the aspects of feasibility, usability, viability, and value. And they look also at something that's, I just say we don't really want to have, but it's an engagement, because engagement is not our main value, but it's important. We look at engagement because we want to be sure that people actually click and use our content and consume our content. And I'll move to editorial. And well, editors are those who provide the domain knowledge which drives the data scientist's work with regard to recommendations quality, their adherence to editorial guidelines. they look at 4 different aspects. They look at compliance. They are those who help us keep content safe from legal, editorial, and reputational risk. They know the content catalog very well. So they are those who point us to outliers, who point us to patterns, who say, oh, these 2 pieces of content, they don't fit well together. This is sensitive content. You don't want users to see these 2 articles next to each other. And by doing so, they help us ensure the content that is surfaced is as accurate, impartial, and relevant as it can be, and that it does not cause harm or offense, and particularly when dealing with difficult content. And they even help us just when we find something we cannot solve with the metadata and data we've got, they help us with additional metadata. We can just feedback and say, oh, we really need some, I don't know, tone tagging for articles so that it's easier for us to actually get what we want to achieve. And so, just to finish my presentation, we have some open questions. But first, I want to start from just by the question of these events, which is optimizing for what? I can say we optimize for editorial judgment. And, but as I've just said, this is not easy. And this happens through a collaborative approach, which leverages a diversity of viewpoints. So that we bring together people with different skills and task-relevant knowledge and try to ensure that all of those are reflected. But, and this is important also because we need to take a holistic point of view, which is recommendations. Our recommendations don't live in isolation. On a page you find recommended content, non-recommended content, and different, the different parts of a page have to just live in the same space. And then this collaboration, that's a tightrope to walk. There's an inherent tension between these 3 functions. And when they are balanced, when they work together, it's great. It's a great process. And we are also happy just to work together. But also sometimes, when they are balanced, that trade-off and compromises that we make just can distort outcome. And they can bias solutions toward narrower notions of success. So I'll finish with 4 points that we still haven't solved until now. The first is scale. These approaches worked until now, and but it might be hard to scale it, especially as the number of recommenders across the organization increases. We don't have many more. The BBC has lots of different services and products, and we cannot scale the same way, the number of editors who help us. The second thing is success. I think we just heard that you cannot improve something you cannot measure. We measure success to a certain point, but then when our recommenders go live, our only measure of success is click-through rate, and we are aware that this is a problem we have to address. But in large organizations, there are lots of constraints, and things are possibly take some time to move. Under the organizational point of view, we had to find, and we still need to improve our common language across data, editorial, and product. Data literacy is key in that process, and we've started organizing courses and training for that, but there's a long way to go. And I just finished because time is up. And just values. We were talking about amplification and what is wrongful, what the aims should be, and especially under a social media perspective. I think it's good to finish this session talking about public service media, because we are in the, we are privileged to have already a set of values we can refer to, and it's like as if we've done the first step. We know what our values are. Now it's about how we put it in practice and how we ensure they are reflected in our recommendations. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, so that was, I think, a fascinating series of talks, and it was great hearing it kind of thoroughly and together, because I think there's a nice link here between thinking about the things we care about on a normative level, the practical implementation and the challenges of measuring things and bringing people together, like Aviv talked about, then the human process of creating a dynamic and a workflow that can bridge these two things. So I really think this is excellent final reform section. When I read your papers initially, I read them like before the workshop started, and I read all these questions, and they're all totally changed now because the workshop, then I wound up rereading your papers today, stuck on the train, and thinking about them different. And so I would love to hear from each of you, what about your own papers do you view or feel differently about after everything else you've seen here? And maybe we'll just go in the order of the talks, if that works.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me all right? Yeah. Feeling differently about the paper, I think what I've been scribbling is the incredibly interesting resonances across a number of the papers that we workshop on Thursday, and then we've been presenting publicly. And I'd just like to pick up a couple. I mean, there are the obvious resonances with Alessandro's view from inside the BBC and the struggles involved in the kind of complex cultural connections across data science, editorial, and product development. But I think more interesting to me are two things. One, what are the resonances with Ben and Helen's paper about the problem of good epistemic processes? Because they were posing, in a very different direction, knowledge, news information, very profound questions, and I love that resonance with our work. The other thing I just pick up, interestingly, from listening now to Aviv, your excursion into deliberative democracy, into citizen assemblies, participatory methods, representation, deliberation. I was very much taken back to Seth Lazar's paper, and his idea of communicative justice. I think there are many resonances actually also with my paper. But in particular, Seth's insistence on this wonderful idea of moral equality. Anyway, just some thoughts.
Aviv, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess one thing I would say is that it's when you write a sort of a paper that's like, oh, we're trying to accelerate sort of investment in a set of areas. This is going back to the bridging piece, and then seeing like in the 2 years and almost since we started that, having there be so much more like people building and sort of doing more of that work. It's just been super incredibly exciting to see all the different connections and all the momentum toward bridging work that is not just inside platforms, little bits and pieces, but in public in so many of the papers here. And also it's been really interesting to see the practical, like the sort of nitty-gritty practical details. Like I really appreciate your paper in particular, because it goes into here the sort of three sort of stakeholders within this organization that need to be navigated in order to achieve that goal. This is something I've seen a lot in practice, but I don't have the ability to make that explicit for the organizations that I'm talking to. And like the different stakeholders that are all sort of needing to both collaborate or maybe even might be in conflict in actually getting these things to happen within those organizations, even though there might be at the very top some set of incentives. Like maybe, there's an argument to be made that if you implement bridging at varying levels, it actually decreases content moderation costs in a significant way, right? And there's some evidence to suggest that might be the case. It's not really public, but now it's in Facebook papers that have been released. They don't explicitly make that point, but they do sort of point out the decrease in things that were sort of like removed after the fact. And so at the very top, maybe like, Mark Zuckerberg or whoever might like get more profit in a sense because they're doing bridging, because there's less cost on content moderation. But the actual sort of org structure might make that difficult because you have someone who's on newsfeed who's trying to increase engagement, and you have someone on content moderation who's trying to decrease costs, but maybe that there isn't really alignment in terms of their individual incentives as people within an organization. And so I see there being almost still some scholarship that's missing that I'm excited to see around, and some more practical work around how do you actually do this within an organization effectively to sort of square that circle.
Thanks. Well, just on my side, I think there are lots of things that I don't know if they would lead me to just make things or write things differently in my paper, but definitely some aspects I started thinking of. There is the aspect of metrics and the technical approaches. Just hearing about this bridging approach is brilliant. We are already aware that metrics already exist that could be used to optimize our recommenders for. But seeing like this aspect in practice and seeing like just empirical evidence that this could be a solution, I think it was very good. Another thing which we haven't considered, but mostly because of lack of time and space, it's we describe this kind of triangle of data, editorial, and product. And of course, it's much broader than that. It's just that this happens within an organization. So it's influenced by lots of other functions. It's influenced by all the complexities within a large organization. You maybe you going in a direction and thinking you're doing well, and then just you hear there's somewhere in another part of the organization, something is happening that one day will lead to your work just being worthless but you don't know. It's like this, you hear that like your ear is just perceiving something. But just jokes aside, there's these, and just going even broader, we haven't really considered the effect of the audiences, because this triangle, and there's the organization, and then there's the largest societal setting in which we are based, and just how does our project process change, our development process change when we take audiences into account? How should we should we think about a participative approach? Should we find a way to hear what audiences think about our recommendation? I really would like to, but of course, again, that comes with some complexities. And the very last thing, and was something that Georgina just mentioned in her presentation. She mentioned that personalization is empirically and normatively inadequate, which is something we haven't really questioned, because there is this assumption that, people expect personalization. Personalization is cool. I mean, I think just going, that could be a rabbit hole it's my job. If I just find out that personalization is not good, I would be I will lose my job, because basically developing recommenders see what I do. But it's an interesting point. Sometimes we take it for granted that, we should offer personalization because that's what everyone does. Well, possibly not necessarily, because as an organization, our values are different. I won't go into that, because that there's this thin line between my personal opinion and the organizational opinion. And
yes, that's I think this idea of personalization versus scale was rich throughout all of your talks, and especially thinking about musical context, we have these sort of local musical movements that form that you were part of at one point in time, but we also have the hit of the summer that comes from the top down, and so I would love to hear a little bit from each of you while folks are submitting questions online. How do we think about those trade-offs across the scale? If we have more of the hit songs, we lose the local countercultures or subcultures, or for Aviv's case, if we're trying to bridge at some sort of larger national level, are we losing local politics in this space? And then for the BBC, how do you handle these sort of trade-offs between scales of work? This is an area that I think is really interesting.
Totally. Thanks. I'll take that first. I've written a whole paper on this. I'll send you it, Joe.
Oh, great. Yeah.
So again, what it's not a zero-sum game, right? We need channels that do enable kind of large-scale communication across very large groups. The great British public, the great American public, and we do have them, and we need those things to continue. But we also, of course, need to pluralize, and we need smaller sort of spaces of exchange. We need the indie music, but we also need for communities to be able to speak to themselves, and for communities to speak to each other and to the nation, right? So we need a really interesting, rich kind of architecture here. And that, so nobody's against the big hits, me least. But to have only that, or to have that always rising to the top, seems to be, at the moment, the problem.
Any other thoughts from down the table?
So I think just under the perspective, just from the BBC perspective, there are two different things that should be distinguished. First of all, well, as an organization, we do more than, like, we are producer of content and we distribute our content. And I think without mentoring recommender system, BBC already has like this local news and tries to balance just with, and using like manual curation and editorial curation tries to balance this aspect of local and UK-wide content, possibly more niche content, and let's say more, how would you say, in a way that is not demeaning them, just it's more popular content in a sense. It's I don't know. Think about BBC series. There are, I think, for all tastes, and I think in the side of entertainment, there is a lot. When it comes to recommendations, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to that, because very often our answer has been dealing with editorial and product and just talking about, what recommendations should go on that page. And the solution has been, well, either having some parts focusing on recommendations, some parts being customized, as in just showing your local news, other parts using approaches that were kind of hybrids, personalized and editorial approaches, for instance, ranking some list of editorially selected content. But it's still something, just we are still creating our own approach. So I'd be happy to tell you more next year, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Exciting. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth remembering that with things like bridging, the goal is very much not homogenization, and that's not even achievable in any sense. If you think about any sort of great conflicts in history between countries or even between people, no amount of bridging systems or like ranking systems is going to make like Hamilton and Burr not angry, whatever. Like there's just no like France and Germany back whenever and nowadays you talk about, let's say, Israel Palestine. No amount is going to change who those people are. It's a question of, can people see that there are things that they all agree on? Can you create a space where the conversation is not just kinetic conflict, but where the conversation is, we're going to actually try to understand each other a little bit. We're gonna see that you are people too, and that's in a sense what you're aiming for, and it's really all you can achieve, because we all have incredible amounts of inertia in terms of who we are, and that's a very, very strong countervailing force, and no amount of ranking system or even generative systems are going to be able to fully overcome.
So I think we're going to move to questions from the audience folks here, and if we have about 15 minutes before lunch, so we've got plenty of time, I think. Go ahead.
Cool. Thanks for the panel. So my question starts with Alejandro's talk as context, but I think that it touches on things that all the panelists have talked about. So I'm particularly interested in this relationship between the data scientists and the editorial staff, because I think that kind of relationship is pretty unique and not one that's explored or doesn't come up as often. It's similar to other things that do, but I think distinctly different. So for example, it's similar to the connection between data scientists and product teams that usually happens at big tech companies. But in that kind of interaction, I think it's usually the data scientists run A/B tests and the product teams look at those metrics and have input into which ones to pick. And obviously many more complex inputs, but they have outcome metrics that they're looking at, whereas the editorial curation seems more qualitative and about the content, if I'm understanding correctly. Another thing that it triggers to me or sounds similar to is like reinforcement learning from human feedback, but it's not quite that. You can imagine editorial staff looking at like 2 feeds of content and saying which one is better. But unlike in the RLHF case, they're not being paid $1 an hour and they have more power, and you're not trying to automate them away. You want them always in this process. And then it's also sort of similar to users trying to control their own feed, except it's actually that they're sort of controlling at a meta level. What should the algorithm be doing for users? So I'm just really curious to hear more about concretely what that interaction looks like between, like, how does it work? Are they actually looking at different feeds? Is it mainly that they curate the post and then the ranking goes on top of it, like you said, or they choose certain parts where ranking shouldn't be used? It's hard to give feedback on algorithms in general, so I'm curious, are there tools that you think would be helpful for the editorial staff that would make it easier to do this kind of fine-tuning back and forth? And I guess the broader question is, all of the talks I think touched at, who gets to decide what we are optimizing when we get to this meta problem that I think Alejandro talked about so concretely. When you have these multiple groups and there's asymmetry in their knowledge, how should you, what are some tools that we can do that make that easier? Thanks.
Well, that's that's a big question. I mean, I won't be lengthy because otherwise I can get into the rabbit hole and telling you just how we do this, how we do that. But just like a premise, we have made the like a choice. When we started, and I think it was from the very start of our team, and I wasn't there back then, but that basically we would rather go for simpler, possibly less accurate approaches in terms of recommenders. But understandable, by humans, and more transparent, rather than going for something that would give us, just higher accuracy but harder to tweak. And so this has been always our starting point. I can say I can tell you about some very practical things we do. And one thing is we routinely have meetings with editorial. We have weekly meetings with editorial, where, for instance, depending on where we are in the editorial product, of course, but depending on where we are in the development process, we talk about different things. For instance, when we start, the development process for a new recommender, possibly a product gets more input in that, because, for instance, we define where the new recommender should go, what it should do, and but let's say at the time of problem definition, we are all together in a room, so that's just ensuring all voices are heard. But then, the more you move towards a more technical side, then, well, of course, it depends on where we are. But for instance, when we get to, selecting just a couple of models that seem to be promising, in these regular meetings, we show the output to editorial, just using some sample of either users or sample of piece of content, and they drive the conversation about, oh, this is problematic. This sounds like just you are surfacing together these sensitive content to these other sensitive content, and this is an association we don't want to make. And I think editorial is just, they are those who are best placed to tell you this, because sometimes, well, I can get to some of the things myself, but in other things, they are the experts of. We have a thick book that are the editorial guidelines, and just they are the experts on that. So, and in order to facilitate these sessions, we develop a tool, which is basically a web UI, where you can pick 2 different models, weights, and pick either just some piece of content, some seed content, or some user profiles. There are different approaches we follow, and there's a scale like editorial can use. Of course, editorial is not just one person in the room. We have multiple people, and possibly we have one from our team, who is Anna, here. But we generally have people who are experts on the specific product we are working on, like BBC Sounds, which is a on-demand audio platform of the BBC, or iPlayer, which is on-demand video platform, or news, and so on and so forth. And so they they leave feedback interval on this scale, just for each recommendations, and they also leave textual feedback. Now, we are aware that usually just this way you can only evaluate small samples, but this has been useful for us because just as data scientists we say, oh, okay, just let's talk through these, just why do you think that this is inappropriate? Do you think that this shouldn't appear in a list of recommendations? Should it be maybe done later? Should we go down? You know, just understanding what the problems are, and then just going back and, you know, by tweaking the models. And this is why so far we've worked with relatively simple models, because it's been easier for us, first of all, to start this kind of conversation, but also to tweak the models. And you know, once just we become kind of, let's say, experts in this kind of process, we will be able to move on to more complex approaches and just scale these approaches. Does it answer your question?
Maybe I could come in and just pick up a couple of things, more general things. I mean, first of all, I really liked, Smithy, your question because you raised, you know, the question of the precarity of moderation and so on, and the interesting prospect that maybe an organization like the big public broadcasters hold out, that, you know, this kind of relationship that Alessandro is describing, you know, could be on a different footing. How about that, you know? Second point, which you also took up, was the user interface. And I mean, that we've had this several times through the few days, which is the idea of, you know, actually, giving choice to users, you know, part of transparency, part of accountability, you know, why not, in fact, hand some agency in terms of the kind of recommender, you know, which interests me. And I think the third one I wanted to pick up is just, if you'll forgive me, Anna and Alessandro, in our talking, you very much conveyed a much more general problem, which is the problem of the values of the professional culture, and the fact that even inside the BBC, you know, getting data science, editorial, product development, higher management to sort of know, you know, and to be able to talk together about what is being sought editorially, what are the values, some of the values I listed. This is not a trivial problem. And to me, it's a lateral link to the big debate in AI trainings, which many of you know about, at the major engineering universities, about how should AI scientists be trained, right? And so far, this is one bugbear of mine, it's stuck on ethics. And I want to say that ethics isn't enough. There are many different kinds of thought, knowledge, political philosophy, social science, of psychology, social psychology we've been hearing the last few days. These have tremendously significant contributions to make. And ethics is a little bit vanilla to me. So just to be cheeky, I'll say that.
Thank you. Yeah, so I want to appreciate what Smith had brought up and sort of what Alejandro was saying, is especially this idea that, you know, there is a process which editors are doing, which is essentially training a recommender system. And what is it that we're doing when we are liking and commenting and whatever? We are training a recommender system. The difference is that in one case you have highly paid editors with a lot of experience who are not representative of the broader public. And on the other hand, you have people who are representative of the broader public, but who don't have any time, are not compensated, and are just sort of responding with their gut reaction. And so, like, in some sense, the idea, the point of this, using this representative microcosm, the citizen assembly, to actually be making these decisions, is to say, let's do something in the middle. Let's take that representative public, a much smaller set of people than you have with the entire, everyone who's using, let's say, Facebook, but give them a lot of the context, give them access to those experts, give them access to the same types of context that an editor might have, and say, okay, here's an example of a bunch of different ways that the ranking system might output something. What do you think? Discuss amongst yourselves. Hear, like, what are the trade-offs of different things given the way that actually might affect your lives to have this kind of output from a recommender system. And then that is a way that we can determine what we should be optimizing for. And just one other clarification, because I realized it wasn't totally clear from what I said earlier. The acquisition, the thing with Twitter, there's collateral damage that this ended. There was no intention by anyone involved to, like, mess up that project, because I want to make absolutely clear that.
So we have about 5 minutes left before lunch. We'll try to get through the last two questions here. We'll go a little quicker through them if we can, and then we'll see how it goes. But this is just such fascinating things we could discuss forever, and then everyone will be hungry and mad at me for not moderating.
Hi, I'm Georgina. I'm glad to see a fellow anthropologist here. I'm also an anthropologist working in tech. In anthropology, we are often talking about individualistic versus collectivistic cultures and values. I wonder if successes around deliberative digital democracy in particular are successful in places like Taiwan because they are a collectivistic culture, versus we are also very much on the focus of this conference seems to be like talking about values embedded in individualistic cultures. Products that are being like developed by companies have inherently embedded values that are based on individualistic cultures and where they are coming from. And this brings me to a distinction that I make between like rights and obligations we have as citizens versus rights and obligations we have as consumers. And I was curious to hear if you could perhaps speak to that, like how we can actually think about the values that are embedded, given that distinction that these are different things, and talking about who is going to decide, for example, or who is going to curate what. If you could like think in this framework and not expect from companies to like treat us as citizens when we are actually just consumers.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to come back because great ideas and say, first of all, you know as well as I do as a fellow anthropologist that we're in danger of reifying these ideas of individualistic cultures and collective cultures. I mean, there are lots of collectivist communities, most of us belong to some of them, within a highly individualistic culture like the United States today or Great Britain today. Second point to make, as I alluded to very briefly, but it's a much larger theme in the paper, is that none of these things are static, right? We're all being formed all the time. Brett is clapping over there because we agree on this. Like, we aren't one thing. We're emergent as human beings. We become what our immediate environment and our much larger environment incentivizes us, to use your term, or nudges us or encourages us to become. That's why the culture matters, right? That's why our media culture has enormous impact on us. Back to an old debate in media theory. So I would kind of say that. On citizens and consumers, I have a very cheap one, which is that in the British debate over policy and regulation in the last 20 years, we've wanted to bring these two together, make this homunculus, the citizen-consumer. Because in whatever domain you talk about, be it like, The Wire, or Taylor Swift, or my indie band, like we are both consumers and more. We're moral human beings. We belong to communities. So that distinction seems to me one that we should erode and be interested in eroding, even if in the end we kind of are consumers sometimes.
So you have 2 questions left. Can we do rapid fire, both questions, one after the other, and then each respondent gets 3 sentences to answer both, or something like that. We'll figure it out.
All right, we'll try it. Okay, so hi, I'm Sarah. I used to work at Twitter, focusing on information integrity. So I was lucky enough to be part of Birdwatch's red teaming exercise, so trying to foresee the risks. So in that vein, I have a question about bridging systems. So especially when they leave the laboratory and enter the real world, which is unfortunately an adversarial threat environment, how can we work to make bridging systems more resilient against 2 types of risks? So one I would call coordinated activity, so bad actors perhaps coordinating to game the system, which might result in unintended consequences. And then something a little more subtle, but potentially insidious, and maybe we're seeing that now on the platform as the user base has changed greatly since the original training data that I'm assuming the Birdwatch model is trained on. What happens if the median point of view were to shift in one direction or another? When I say median point of view, I mean the average Twitter user participating in this program. Does that shift the Overton window of the notes that meet the requirements of agreement on the opposing viewpoints to actually make it to get published? And why I think this is significant is because Birdwatch, super cool. The team that built it was building something great, and it still has survived, and it's often pointed in the industry as something that shows that bridging systems can be successful. But I want to make sure we're also interrogating the potential vulnerabilities before we then try to completely replace human moderation or other remediations. So that is my question. We can also talk after.
All right. Aviv, do you want to do a 1 or 2 sentence quick response, and then we'll talk after the lunch, and then we'll try work?
Sure. Don't replace human moderation completely. First of all, we remember the status quo right now. If the Twitter timeline was using bridging-based ranking, not just Birdwatch, that would be probably a huge win for society, even though there would be some of these impacts, because we already have gaming. We already have all those issues are already present. They're just actually probably worse in many cases when you don't have bridging systems. And there are a lot of nuances, and that's not 100% true. But I'm going to leave it at that and just say that this is why we need incredible amounts of investment to figure out how to answer all of these questions as quickly as possible, because the status quo is pretty bad.
Well, thank you, everyone. This is a fantastic panel. If you have a round of applause for our wonderful speakers.